The war had lasted for 11 standard cycles. 11 cycles of fire, ash, and screaming stars. A grand alliance of 34 sentient species had once believed themselves invincible. Their combined fleets blackened the void between galaxies. Their technology could reshape moons into cannons. Their soldiers could fight in vacuum without suits for short, terrible minutes. But none of it had been enough against the Swarm. The Swarm was not a race in the way the galaxy understood races. It was a living, evolving nightmare collective intelligence that fed on energy and matter alike. It had started on the edge of the Triangulum Galaxy and had eaten its way through 12 star systems before they even noticed. By the time the first scout ships were lost, the Swarm had already adapted to energy weapons. By the time the first fleet engaged, the Swarm had learned to mimic decoys. Now, after 11 years of retreat, the S-capital world Ethelberg, the shining heart of diplomacy and hope, was under siege. Admiral Xylos of the Vorkith species stood on the main bridge of the Hammer of Dawn, watching the tactical map bleed red. Vorkith were tall, four-armed creatures with skin like cracked lava. They were natural warriors, bred for endurance. But even Xylos felt something cold and wet twisting in his lower stomach: fear. He had not felt fear in 40 years. "Report," he said. His voice a low rumble. A young Scylan, small, furry, with 6 bright eyes, clicked her mandibles nervously. "Admiral, the outermost defense platforms are gone. The Swarm is using captured frigates as battering rams. We have 47 capital ships left. They have thousands." Xylos closed his 3 eyelids. Thousands. The Swarm reproduced by consuming mass. Every destroyed ship became raw material for a dozen new Swarm vessels. Every lost world fed their endless hunger. It was not a war. It was an extinction event with a slow pulse. "What of the human request?" Xylos asked. He had almost forgotten it. 3 standard months ago, a human diplomat named Ambassador Chen had appeared before the council. She had presented a single proposal: let humanity deploy 1 warship of their own design. 1 ship, no support, no questions. In exchange, humanity would ask for nothing: no territory, no technology, no political power. The council had laughed. Then, when Ambassador Chen did not laugh back, they had grown uncomfortable. Finally, they had politely declined. Humanity was a minor species. They had joined the only 20 years ago. Their military was considered primitive: kinetic weapons, fission power, no FTL of their own. They relied on jump gates. What could 1 human ship do against the Swarm? But now, with Ethelberg burning, Xylos was willing to try anything. "Give me Ambassador Chen," he said. Ambassador Chen was not a soldier. She was a pale, thin woman with graying hair and glasses, actual physical glasses, which most species found quaint. When her image appeared on the bridge screen, she was sitting in a small, bare room. Behind her, a single window showed a gray, rainy sky, Earth. She looked tired. "Admiral Xylos," she said calmly, "I assume you're not calling to discuss trade agreements." "Your ship," Xylos said. "The one you offered. Is it real?" Chen smiled. It was a small, sad smile. "It's been real since the day we joined the... We just didn't think you'd need it so soon." "Where is it?" "It's already there." The screen flickered. Chen's face was replaced by a tactical overlay. A single dot appeared on the edge of the Ethelberg system. It was labeled simply, "Human Vessel Eternal Vigil." No class. No armament list. No crew complement. Just a name. Xylos stared. 1 ship. Against the Swarm fleet of... What is the latest count? Another officer called out. "Over 8,000 hostiles and growing." 8,000? Xylos repeated. He looked back at the dot. "Ambassador, your species has a word for this. Suicide." "We have another word," Chen said. "Faith." She cut the link. The Eternal Vigil did not look like a warship. It looked like a spear long, needle thin, built entirely of a dark, non-reflective alloy. No windows. No external weapons. No engines that species could recognize. It drifted toward the Swarm fleet at a speed that seemed almost lazy. On the bridge of the Hammer of Dawn, every screen was focused on the human vessel. Xylos had ordered all surviving ships to hold position. He did not know why. Perhaps because there was nothing left to lose. The Swarm noticed the newcomer. Of course they did. Their collective mind processed the data in less than a heartbeat. A single ship. Unknown design. No FTL signature. Likelihood of threat, negligible. The swarm dispatched a single hunter-killer, a jagged, organic-looking thing the size of a small moon, to investigate. The hunter-killer opened fire with plasma lances. The Eternal Vigil did not evade. It did not raise shields. It simply absorbed the shots. The plasma splashed against its hull and vanished, as if poured into a bottomless well. Then the human ship did something that made every being on the Hammer of Dawn go silent. It pulsed. A single, low-frequency wave of energy radiated outward from the Eternal Vigil. It was not a weapon. It was not a communication. It was something in between, a kind of question. A mathematical proof broadcast in gravity waves, light, and quantum spin. It asked, "What is the purpose of consuming without end?" The hunter-killer stopped. Its plasma cannons went dark. Its engines sputtered. For 3 seconds, it floated dead in space. Then it turned and fired on the swarm fleet. What just happened? Xylos whispered. His tactical officer, a crustacean-like Thraxian named Kavoth, scrambled to analyze the data. "Admiral, the human ship appears to have overridden the swarm's command protocols. The hunter-killer is no longer hostile. It is broadcasting Alliance IFF codes." "Impossible," Xylos said. "The swarm has no single command node. It is a distributed intelligence. You cannot hack it." "They didn't hack it," Kavoth said slowly. "They reasoned with it." That made no sense. The swarm did not reason. It consumed. But as they watched, the Eternal Vigil pulsed again. This time, the wave was different, a recursive logic loop, a proof that any system that grows without bound will inevitably collapse into a single, cold, meaningless point. The swarm's goal to consume all matter and energy was not victory. It was the end of all experience, the end of all sensation, the end of the swarm itself. The swarm fleet began to shudder, not from weapons fire, from doubt. For the first time in its existence, the collective intelligence experienced a contradiction. Its primary directive, consume, led to a secondary outcome, self-annihilation. The logic was unassailable. The proof was elegant. And the Eternal Vigil presented it, not as an attack, but as a gift. The human ship pulsed a third time. This wave carried something simpler, a single image. A photograph of a human child holding a flower. The caption, in basic galactic standard, "This is also real." One by one, the swarm vessels went dark. Their weapons powered down. Their hive mind link fragmented. Thousands of individual ships, each one a living creature grown from stolen matter, suddenly became alone for the first time. They drifted, confused, like orphaned whales. Then the Eternal Vigil opened a channel. "This is Captain Elias Vasquez of the United Nations Space Vessel Eternal Vigil," a calm male voice said across all frequencies. "The swarm intelligence has been dissolved. What remains are individual biomechanical entities with no directive. They are not our enemies. They are refugees." Xylos's jaw, all for mandibles of it, hung open. Refugees? These things ate 12 star systems. They did, Captain Vasquez agreed. But they were following orders. The Queen intelligence is gone. These are just soldiers who woke up from a nightmare. We will provide them with basic guidance protocols. In return, they will help rebuild what they destroyed. The bridge was silent. Then a young human liaison officer, one of the few humans stationed on the Hammer of Dawn, started laughing. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had just watched impossibility become reality. Xylos turned to her. "You knew about this ship?" The liaison, a woman named Lieutenant Maria Okonkwo, shook her head. "I knew he had something in the back pocket. But this is humanity." "Explain," Xylos demanded. Lieutenant Okonkwo took a breath. "Admiral, every other species in the tried to build bigger guns, better shields, faster ships. Humanity tried something else. We studied the swarm's communication protocols for 20 years. We learned their language, not words, but math. We realized the swarm wasn't evil. It was just incomplete. It had never encountered a concept like mercy, or beauty, or choice. So we built a ship that could teach those things." "You weaponized philosophy," Kavoth said, his voice full of wonder. "No," Lieutenant Okonkwo said. "We weaponized hope. The battle, if it could still be called that, was over in less than an hour." The Eternal Vigil continued to pulse, each wave reaching deeper into the swarm fleet. Ships that had been moments from firing on Ethelberg suddenly stopped. Some began to emit confused signals, the first individual thoughts they had ever had. One small swarm scout, no larger than a shuttle, broadcast a simple image, a star. Just a star. It was asking, "Is that pretty?" The ships watched in stunned silence. Not a single shot had been fired by the human vessel. Not a single explosion. The swarm had not been defeated. It had been convinced. Admiral Xylos finally sat down in his command chair. He felt ancient. He also felt something he had not felt in years: relief. He opened a private channel to Ambassador Chen. "You didn't tell us," he said. "All these years, you never told us." Chen's face appeared again. She had a cup of tea in her hands. Human tea. "Would you have believed us?" Xylos thought about it. No, they would not have believed. They would have called it fantasy. They would have demanded weapons tests. They would have tried to replicate the technology and probably broken it. The was good at war. It was terrible at peace. "Why didn't you use this ship earlier?" Xylos asked. "Why wait until we were on the brink?" Chen set down her tea. "Because the swarm had to be ready. If we had used the vigil too soon, the Queen intelligence would have adapted. It would have built a defense against logic, against beauty, against hope. We needed the swarm to be desperate too. Desperate enough to listen." Xylos had no response. He simply watched the tactical map as more and more swarm vessels turned from red to green. The aftermath was not clean. It was never clean. The former swarm ships, now calling themselves the Awakened, were strange and difficult neighbors. They had no culture, no art, no history except consumption. But they learned quickly. Within a standard month, the first Awakened ship asked to visit a planet, not to consume it, to see a flower. The council held an emergency session. There was shouting. There were threats of secession. Several species demanded that the Awakened be destroyed, that humanity had committed a crime by not killing them all when they had the chance. Ambassador Chen spoke for 3 hours. She did not argue. She simply told stories. Stories of human wars that had ended in forgiveness. Of enemies who became friends. Of a species that had once nearly destroyed itself with nuclear fire and had chosen, instead of revenge, to rebuild. In the end, the council voted. The Awakened would be allowed to remain. They would be given a small, empty star system at the edge of space. They would be watched. They would be helped. And in return, they would spend the next 100 years helping to rebuild the worlds they had destroyed. It was not justice. It was not mercy. It was something in between. Something human. Captain Elias Vasquez never returned to Earth. He stayed aboard the Eternal Vigil, which now orbited the Awakened's new home system. His mission had changed. He was no longer a weapon. He was a teacher. Every day, he broadcast lessons: mathematics, art, music, ethics. The Awakened listened. They had a lot to learn. One day, a former swarm battleship now named Remembered Joy sent him a message. It was a simple tune, a melody. The first original music ever composed by an awakened mind. Captain Vasquez wept. Then he played the melody back to them, with harmonies added. They were no longer the swarm. They were becoming something new. And the galaxy, the tired, broken, cynical galaxy, watched in disbelief as the lone human warship that had turned the tide became something even stranger. A lighthouse. Admiral Xylos retired a year later. At his farewell ceremony, he gave a speech that was recorded and translated into every language. He spoke for only 2 minutes. For 11 cycles, we believed the swarm could only be destroyed. We built weapons that could crack planets. We trained soldiers who could kill without thought. We became monsters to fight monsters. And then, at the very end, a species we had dismissed as primitive showed us a different way. They did not fire a single shot. They did not lose a single life. They simply asked a question. What is the point of winning if you lose your soul? He paused. His forearms trembled slightly. I do not know if humanity is the strongest species in the galaxy. I do not know if they are the smartest. But I now believe they are the wisest. And wisdom, in the end, is the only weapon that never breaks. He saluted the human. Flag, a simple piece of cloth with stars and striped sand. Walked off the stage. Lieutenant Maria Okonkwo was promoted to commander and given command of her own ship, a small diplomatic vessel tasked with helping the Awakened integrate into galactic society. Her first mission was to transport a delegation of Awakened to Earth. They wanted to see where the Eternal Vigil had been built. When they arrived, the Awakened were confused. Earth was not a paradise. It had pollution, poverty, war. But it also had children playing in streets, old people holding hands, dogs chasing balls. One awakened a large, craggy creature that had once been a hunter-killer. Asked Commander Okonkwo, "Why do you not fix these problems?" She thought for a moment. "Because we're still learning. Just like you." The awake and nodded slowly. Then it pointed a claw at a small girl flying a kite. "That is pretty," it said. "Yes," Okonkwo said. "Yes, it is. 5 years after the Battle of Ethelberg." "No, not a battle. The awakening." That was the word the historian settled on. The awakening. A historian from the Scylan species wrote a book about it. The title was The Ship That Taught the Swarm to Dream. It became a bestseller across the galaxy. But the most popular chapter was short. It described a single conversation between Captain Vasquez and an awakened entity that had once been the Swarm's second-in-command. The awakened asked, "Why did you spare us?" Captain Vasquez replied, "Because someone spared us once." "Who?" "Ourselves. A long time ago. We were the Swarm once on our own planet. We consumed everything. We fought everyone. We almost died. Then we chose to stop. And we've been choosing to stop every day for thousands of years. It's not easy, but it's worth it." The awakened was silent for a long time. Then it asked, "Will you teach us how?" "We already have," Captain Vasquez said. "You just asked for help. That's the first step." The Eternal Vigil never left the awakened system. It became a museum, a school, and a sanctuary. Thousands of tourists from across the came to see it. They walked through its narrow corridors. They touched its dark, non-reflective hull. They stood in the small room where Captain Vasquez had broadcast the pulses that saved the galaxy. And on the wall of that room, carved into the metal by an unknown hand, were 7 small words: "We were not brave, we were kind." Below that, in smaller letters, and it was enough, the galaxy did not forget what humanity had done. But more importantly, the galaxy changed. New alliances formed between old enemies. The development of weapons slowed. The development of schools, hospitals, and art galleries accelerated. The awakened, once feared, became beloved in some systems, especially after they helped divert a rogue asteroid from a populated world using nothing but their own bodies. They were, after all, very durable, but the greatest change was invisible. It happened in the hearts of sentient beings across the. They began to ask themselves a question that had never occurred to them before. What if the point of strength is not to crush, but to lift? And every time they asked, they thought of a lone human warship that had turned the tide without firing a shot. And they smiled. Captain Elias Vasquez died of old age 30 years after the awakening. He was 102 years old, ancient by human standards, but young by many others. His last words, spoken to an awakened nurse who had once been a swarm destroyer, were, "Keep listening. The universe has more to say." The awakened nurse, who had chosen the name Melody, held his hand until he stopped breathing. Then she sang the song he had taught her, the one about hope. The song traveled across the stars. It was picked up by radio telescopes on 100 worlds. It was translated into 1,000 languages. And somewhere, in a small, rainy city on Earth, a child heard it on an old recording and decided to become a pilot, because that's what hope does. It spreads. The Eternal Vigil remained in orbit around the Awakened's world for another 50 years. Then, on the 80th anniversary of the awakening, it did something unexpected. It powered up its engines that had not been used since the day it arrived, and set a course for the edge of the galaxy. The awakened sent a frantic message, "Where are you going?" The ship's automated systems replied, "To find the next swarm, the next hungry, lonely, frightened intelligence that has never been told that it has a choice." The final pulse from the Eternal Vigil was not a weapon. It was not a lesson. It was a single word, broadcast on all frequencies, in every language: hello. And somewhere, in the cold, dark void between galaxies, something that had been sleeping for 1 billion years opened its eyes. It heard the word, and for the first time, it wondered,